Cool. So welcome to the WP Crowd. We're doing a free training series. Everything is completely custom. So this was actually a training series or this particular training was actually requested from someone who in the end couldn't make it because of the time change. But we want to do more of these. So if you do want to have a customized training session for anything WordPress related, whether it's code, how to set something up, a plugin, really anything and everything, we can try to cater a whole training session to you and your needs. Obviously, it might be a little more broad. I had someone ask me about a very specific request for their plugin. This isn't free support time. It's a training, so we want people to learn. So I will broaden it out most of the time. But if you do want to learn something and you want more of a hands-on approach like we do here, go ahead and go to the wpcrowd.com. You'll see a link in the navigation to free WordPress training. You can either check out the ones that we have coming up or put in a request, and I will receive the request and find a way to schedule it with you and kind of go from there. So without further ado, I'm Roy Sivan. I'm a developer at the Walt Disney Company. I do this for fun. The WP Crowd. I was blog on the WP Crowd, and you can find me at WordCamps and stuff like that. I am co-presenting today with Robert. So Robert, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Coolio. Hello there. I'm Robert Wild. I'm from Brisbane, Australia. I am a cloud solutions engineer. I mostly work with WordPress, but also build wonderful things in Laravel, and I love playing with AngularJS and Angular and Vue, to name a few. I am a co-organizer and associate at WP Meetup here in Brisbane. And I just love everything technology, basically.
We're doing an introduction to SASS. That was the original question, how do I use SASS? But you can't really talk about SASS with talking about how to convert it to CSS. So we're talking about Gulp as well. And we're kind of putting this all together for you in hopefully a very intro way, so you can kind of understand why you would use SASS, why you need Gulp, and how you can actually empower yourself to write better code with these tools. So, all right, so what are we going to cover? I'm going to talk about a little bit about SASS and what it is, Gulp and what it is. Then we're going to go straight into a demo on my computer, so a screen sharing demo of basically how to get all of this together. I am going to share some code with you. There will be links I share out, whether it's right now or if you're watching on YouTube, probably in the description below. And I have a GitHub repo that's already set up for all the code you need to kind of get going with all of this as an example. Robert's going to go ahead and do the same demo, more or less, just for Windows. Usually I kind of stay away from Windows, but the original person who requested this tutorial was based on Windows, so I was like, all right, I guess I gotta get Robert involved because he's the only Windows developer I really know, and unfortunately he's in Australia, so the timing had to be set up properly, which worked out pretty well. And then finally, once we teach you how to use SASS and what's awesome about it and how to convert it to CSS, how to connect it all to WordPress, and then obviously, and at the end, if there's any questions from you guys, we'll go ahead and take them then. So let's talk about SASS. SASS is syntactically awesome style sheets. That's what it stands for. SASS is a CSS preprocessor. So if you imagine CSS as it is now, CSS is a way to style out your website, saying things like, hey, the background should be red, the color should be blue. It's really a way to add the style to your site. SASS is a way to actually write CSS code and then have it compile into CSS. So it goes from something a little bit more complex and sometimes a lot easier, and then that gets converted into CSS, which the browser can then read. So let me give you some examples of why I love SASS. SASS is super powerful. I'm gonna really just skim like the very, very top of the surface with SASS, but don't think that's all that there is to it. There's a lot to it. And honestly, I've been a front-end developer for close to 20 years now. SASS obviously hasn't been around for 20 years, but I've been using SASS for a very long time, and I use SASS every single day at work. And I probably only use like 5 to 10% of what SASS is good for. Like of all of SASS, what it offers, I probably only use like 5 to 10% of it. Um, so the very first thing that I love SASS for is variables. Basically, you can save things like your brand identity into variables, and then should your brand identity change, or let's say you're a contractor building a whole bunch of websites and each website has its own identity, you can make the change in one place in code and it'll change the rest of your site. So in the example of the slide, I have color blue with a hex code. I then have another variable set to that. I then set it to the color blue. So later on in the site, if I wanted to have all my headings be the same exact color, I could do, like H1, H2 color, and I can use color headings, and that would still be the color blue. And that's great because it's just another layer of having modularity to your code. But if you actually look at the CSS at the bottom, you'll see ID main content paragraph and then ID main content paragraph anchor. So PA, that's right at the bottom. And I have the color set to color blue as the variable, and that's SASS. When you run it through Gulp and it actually converts to CSS, it turns into what you see on the right, which is basically the variables go away and the color is now inputted into the same exact text where the color is. I find this super, super great. When you have a lot of site branding, forget colors. Think about like margin spacing, padding spacing. If you really want a consistent feel for your website, variables really help you kind of just add an easy way to manage all of that. And if you ever want to change anything, you change it in one place, rebuild your CSS, and all of your website can change. It's pretty fantastic. Nesting. So nesting is probably the one thing that sold me on, was less when I originally got into preprocessors, but SASS really. And nesting is a way to not just organize your code, but a way to really just write more intuitive code. So if you look at the code on the left, you'll see that typically you have your definition, so like your main content UL, and then all your parameters for it, like color, padding, things like that. And then it closes, and then you'd have to do the main content UL LI to actually display and change the properties for the LI within that UL. Well, with nesting, you actually can do that all within the same bracket. So you have your UL open bracket, then you have your LI within that bracket, that open bracket, and then even within that LI, you have an A tag with its parameters. So what you see on the left gets converted to what you see on the right, and what you see on the right is what you used to have to write in CSS. And what if you're only writing in CSS right now, what you'd have to do, or what you'd have to write to change, let's say, an anchor tag within that LI. But with CSS or SASS, you can do it with just a little bit more flow. I'm not going to say it's necessarily always less code, because sometimes it's just the same amount of code as far as lines go, but it's definitely a lot more easier to see, especially if you're using an IDE like PHP Storm or Sublime. You can actually really see how things are blocked off. And once you're working in an LI, you'll know, hey, this is within that UL. The last really powerful thing that SASS has that I use quite a bit are mixins. Mixins are basically functions. You don't want to write the same code over and over and over again. So let's say, in this example, I have basically a mixin which adds a border top and border bottom. And because on my website, that's kind of a ongoing style, right? And instead of it being always the same width and always the same color, with a function, I could actually always apply a border top and border bottom and then tell it which color I want, and then also the width. So if you look at the left, you'll see mixin border. It's actually the function being defined. And then underneath it, main content, I just do include and then border as a function. and I pass in the blue color, and I pass in 2 pixels. And then on the right, you see the compiled CSS, which adds in the 2 pixels, the color, and the solid. Well, the solid's already defined in the function, but as you can see, it just adds all that in. This really helps you write less code. When we talk about dry coding, which is do not repeat yourself coding, this is what you want to strive for. And really, it just makes you more an efficient developer. So you can actually really get your file sizes down, a lot less lines of code, things like that. Okay, so let's look at some other cool stuff. So one thing that we use a lot of in our CSS files, because we have quite a bit, are partials. You can actually import in CSS as well. It's just a lot easier with SASS. You can actually do something like import just underscore my partial, which would import by default underscore my partial.scss. And then if you have a whole bunch of those, and then in directories. So I didn't write this as an example, but the way we might have something set up is you might have something like a modules directory. And in the modules directory, you'll have header, footer, sidebar, right? And those are your stylings for those modules. In your main SASS file, your main SCSS file, you'll have imports to all of those. And then you could start grouping them. So all of a sudden you have these groups of imports that really all relate to each other. So modules, I do pages a lot. So CSS for specific pages usually go in the same subdirectory. If I'm using Bootstrap for a project, that goes into its own directory, although Bootstrap I tend to import from the node modules as a dependency. But all of that kind of gets put together. And what happens is your main style sheet, in the example we're actually going to go through, you don't really see this, but in most projects I work on, your main style sheet is actually just a bunch of imports. And it just it runs through all these imports and brings it all together. And that way your code's really modular. It also helps if you're working on a team. When one person needs to work on, let's say, the styling for the homepage, but another person needs to work on the styling for the sidebar, they can work separately because they're in 2 separate files, even though ultimately it's the same style sheet that comes together. Extending an inheritance is another really cool thing with SASS. Let's say you have, let's go back to the mixin as an example. Let's say I had, instead of a mixin, which is the function, I actually had a class, and that class had the border top, basically what you see on the right. It had a border top and a border bottom, and it was just a class. And I could apply that class to the DOM every single time. So anytime in the actual HTML markup, I wanted that border top and border bottom, that very specific 2 pixel with that color solid, I could just apply that class. But you don't always have that control in WordPress because you might have, you might be using a plugin that includes its own HTML, and you don't want to deal with the PHP to modify just to add a class in. So what you can do is actually create a class that might have that kind of default. Let's just call it a default styling with the border top, border bottom. And then you could use @ symbol extend and then dot whatever that class is. And it automatically inherits all the properties from that class and then allows you to override. So let's say I had that as a class. You have border top, border bottom. I could go ahead and do extend, border top, or sorry, border class. And then I could even change the border color on that, on another one. It's really, really cool. I'm not doing it justice with how I'm explaining it. Maybe I'll try to find some time to actually show you a code example, or Robert will, since he's just kind of hanging out right now. But it is a super cool way to kind of keep consistent branding and consistent styling without having to redo a lot of without having to repeat yourself with code. The last bit is math operators. I use these a lot for padding, sizing, sometimes even like width and height. It's really cool that you can just write it in the SASS, do things like divide, multiply, subtract, add. It allows you to really get some powerful operators and some powerful code in. Usually in the past you were restricted by, if you want to do this kind of stuff, to JavaScript. So JavaScript, you would check the height or width of, like, let's say the page, the window, and then you might set the CSS of a specific element to like 50% of that, right? That way it's always 50%. This is a really bad example, but let's just say that's what you needed. So that's what you're going to do, and you use JavaScript for it because that's the only way you could. Well, now with SASS and Calc, you can actually do that right in CSS, and your performance of your site's going to be much more improved because of it. Okay, that was SASS. So ultimately, at the end of the day, all of that SASS code needs to be compiled to CSS. Browsers can't read SASS, so it needs to be CSS. The way to do that is use a task runner. And there's a few task runners out there. Grunt is really popular. It came out a little bit before Gulp. And honestly, there was a big debate whether Grunt or Gulp was going to be more popular. We're going to go through Gulp today. I could show you Grunt, but I find Gulp just a lot easier. Honestly, I used to be a big Grunt fan. And then once I actually sat down with Gulp and actually created something from scratch, I realized how much better it was. From what I've read, it's actually more performant as well. So things like creating your SASS, going from SASS to CSS actually happens a little bit quicker. It might not matter if you're working on one file, but if you, let's say you have 20 files that have calculations and things like that, and a lot of those mix-ins, it's going to play a big role. I've had a site, I don't remember which site I was working on, but I was working on a site where just running the grunt command on it took, I think, somewhere like 2 to 5 seconds, which, again, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're developing a website, waiting for 2 to 5 seconds just to see, like, let's say, a change of color is a long time, and it's just not very efficient. On that site, I actually converted to Gulp, and I remember a significant drop. I think it was still like a second to run because there was a lot of poor performing code, but ultimately it was significantly faster. Now for Gulp, the way it works is you give it tasks, you define out a task, and then you tell it what task you want it to, like what that task does. And then once you define that in the command line, you can actually run just that task. So Gulp is actually in JavaScript. So just to give you an example, once you have Gulp kind of installed into your project, you add on a module called Gulp SASS. And then this is the JavaScript that you're going to run, or that gets written. And it basically just defines out var Gulp, var SASS, which are just the variables. Gulp.task is the main function. It basically takes on the first parameter of the function name. So in this scenario, it's just SASS, S-A-S-S. And then the return, the callback function of that, actually what it does is it first, you'll see that line gulp.src, which is Gulp source. First, it grabs the source files for what you want to do. In the next line, it does pipe, and pipe is basically the Gulp operator. So you tell, inside of every pipe, you tell it what you want it to do. There's actually other modules and add-ons that are a little more performant at times to use other things. So I've used, I can't remember the name of it. There's scenarios where I've used other things besides pipe, but pipe is just the go-to, and it works all the time, and it's not bad. So in that pipe, I do SASS, and then I actually pass an on error just because I want to see any errors that come up. Like if, you know, something's typoed somewhere, you want to see what's going on, not just have the SASS fail. And then ultimately, the last line of any task should be the destination. So you'll see pipe and then Gulp destination. So I start with my file in the assets slash, actually a typo right there in my frame. It should be assets slash SASS slash, and then asterisk asterisk, and then asterisk dot SCSS, which will grab all files within the SASS subdirectory of assets. So in the slide right now, where you see gulp.src, technically that would grab every SASS file or SCSS file from the assets directory. In practice, you want to be a little more specific. You want to put your SCSS files in a SASS directory underneath assets. And then ultimately those all build to /build/CSS. We're going to run all through this. So if you're having a hard time keeping along, these are just for you to see. Otherwise, you're going to see the demo and how it all plays out in a few minutes. So once you have all your tasks created, once you're in command line, you basically, all you have to do is run them. And all you do to run them is gulp, Gulp, space, and then the name of the task. So in the previous example, we had the SASS task defined. So I'm going to write gulp.sass or gulp space sass, and that'll run the SASS task. Another example, gulp watch is another one I use a lot, which runs the, not the attach task, it's actually the watch task. I should have gone through these slides, check typos before. And then if you just run gulp, if you have a task defined as default, that'll run the default task. And we're actually going to use that in our example. But yeah, it's just a great way to have like your default go-to be something. Just for more resources and stuff like that, sasslang.com/guide is a great, has a great beginner. It goes through all the things I just went through with better code examples and explanations. Obviously, check out the WP Crowd and lynda.com for more tutorials. But we're going to be doing a lot more of these on WP Crowd, so make sure to check out the tutorials that we're doing. So I'm going to jump right into coding example here. So just to kind of preface this whole thing, and I think I mentioned this in the beginning, and if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to have all the prerequisites for using Gulp and SASS in the description. But you do need to have Node running, specifically NPM, which is the Node package manager, but it kind of built into Node. If you have a Mac, for the most part, I think it comes out of the box with Node, so you don't have to worry about it. But if for whatever reason you don't have it, and the way to check that is actually running something like terminal and just doing npm-v or node-v, and that'll tell you whether you have it or not. If for whatever reason when you do npm-v and it shows up nothing or npm is not defined, you don't have it. So you're going to have to come to nodejs.org, and it's actually a pretty simple install process. Just install it and you should have it running. It should take pretty quick to run it. So again, here's the SASS Lang website. This is the main website for the SASS language. Obviously, so as I said, some cool code examples here, and obviously a little more explanation. This is our website, the pcrowd, we can close that. And then this is Gulp. Gulp runs, you don't need to actually install anything from their website. This is more of a tutorial website. Basically, we're going to be using npm, which is the Node package manager, to keep Node in our package, in our project. So that way it's just there. As you can see here, npm install, all of that is what we're going to run through right now. And Gulp SASS is actually the module or package that runs the SASS to CSS compiler in Gulp. As you kind of learn more about Gulp, you'll find that there's a huge community around these modules and kind of things you can do. While my code example has a few modules, Gulp, SASS, and watch, some of my Gulp files have, tens of modules that I use for all sorts of different things, between, compiling SASS properly. Auto prefixing is a pretty big one. If you're using not browser wide code, like things like border radius you'd have to put in like -webkit for border radius, or -moz, all the browser prefixes. Auto prefixer is a great module that just automatically adds those. And there's a lot of other really cool modules and obviously I don't know half of them, but definitely check it out. If you're on this path of trying to learn more about development and level yourself up, definitely check out Gulp. It's really fantastic. So I'm gonna open up PHP Storm here, just to give you a quick overview of what you're looking at on my screen. Code is on the right. My directory structure is right here on the left. I have my terminal window down here below. So I'm gonna try to keep it slow, but if you have a hard time seeing what I'm doing, I will open up another terminal window or try to move my mouse around so you can see. So the place we're starting is actually a child theme. So here's, I'll post a link to this. This is where we're going to start. It's going to be the training for this repo and for what we're doing. And the repo has a couple of branches on it. Basically, it runs through all the steps that we're going to do, and step by step shows you how to get Gulp running and how to get it going, and as well as and everything is already done, but I'm basing it off of 2017. So you can see, I'm going to go ahead and load up my local environment. This is my local environment. If I go to the dashboard, I'm actually running this theme right now. So right now this theme is running. It's just a child theme, and here's the style sheet for it that defines out the theme. Nothing too intense right here. If you're doing code with the WordPress, I'm not going to go into why you should be using a child theme, but you should be using a child theme. So let's get started. In the base of this, step 1 is where you want to be. You're going to find assets, SASS, and then this SCSS file. The SCSS file is what we're going to be building into CSS. As I said before, usually we do a lot of imports into this file, into our main SCSS file. I'm not going to do that today because I want this to be a very, very basic intro. But this is the SASS file that we're using. So we're going to go ahead and start there. And you can see this is just basic CSS. There's nothing actually SASS about these 3 lines of code. I'm just telling the body to have a color of red. But we need to get started somewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my code here. I'm actually going to delete this whole directory because I actually have some of the code already kind of started up going already. So I want to start out from scratch where you guys are probably going to start with me. So I'm going to go ahead and open up step 1. That's the branch I want to be on. I'm going to go ahead and come back over to PHP Storm, create clone. And I'm going to put this into the theme. I'm going to do get CD into that frame. Then I'm going to do, make sure I have it. Awesome. And then what we need to do is come back over here. Awesome. So the name changed, but ultimately this is the theme that I have installed. And that's, oh, it's actually this one. Just want to make sure. Cool. We're on the same page now. So if you went to and grabbed the clone the repo and activated the theme, you're just going to see 2017. It should be running just like normal. The next step is to actually get NPM and kind of the packages together. So this is where I said if you don't have NPM, you're going to need it right here. So the first thing you need to do is actually do an NPM init. This actually initializes your directory that you're in as a node project with package manager, so NPM. So I'm just going to do NPM init. I don't really want to change any of these settings, so I'm just going to hit enter a bunch of times. And when I get to the end, I'm just going to hit yes. What that does is actually creates a package.json, which I already had, but that creates a package.json, which then you can start adding stuff to. The way you add stuff to package.json, and this is how we add Gulp. You do npm install save, because we actually want to save it for future use and have it part of the package, or just do Gulp. That's actually going to install our machine locally, like on my machine, and it's going to make sure that Gulp is part of the project. Now, I've had Gulp on my machine already. This is where you might find it tricky. You might want to do something like Gulp V to see what version of Gulp you're running. If, for whatever reason, you get an NPM error where it says Gulp is not defined or it's not a command line tool, you might have to install Gulp itself locally. So go back to that Gulp website I showed you. I'll put a link in the description if you're watching on YouTube. You might have to install Gulp globally as a CLI tool. There's certain scenarios where I've had to do that and certain scenarios where I haven't when I'm kind of working with new people in Gulp. So it's just a warning that you might have to do that. One more thing we need to install, actually two more things. Gulp SASS, which I showed you before, that's the module for actually convert SCSS into CSS. And then I'm going to install one more thing called Gulp Watch, which is actually a watcher. And so the way watchers work is you tell it a file to actually watch, and anytime you hit save on that file, it'll run through a task. For example, in our case, we're going to have it watch the SCSS file. Every time I hit save, I'm going to want it to run through the SASS task. So it compiles my CSS so I can go hit refresh in the browser. Another really cool tip, if you are getting really advanced or you are advanced a little bit more, Gulp has some live reload stuff that you can build into it. So if for whatever reason you want to do that, what you can do is have your SASS on save, compile to CSS, and then your browser will reload by just automatically. It's really sweet when you have it set up properly. I will warn you, it's not easy to set up the first time. I always have difficulties with it. So cool. So we have that going. It looks like I'm in the master branch, so bear with me. The Gulp file is already here. I was going to walk you through how to create it, but it's already here because I'm in the wrong branch, but whatever. This is your Gulp file. It's in the main directory of the theme, and it's just Gulp with a capital F file. I'm not sure the need for the way this is spelled out. It's just how every time I learned how to do it, that's how it was spelled out. And from then on, that's just how I spelled it. And it just works that way. So I'm sure if it was just gulp.js or gulpfile.js or gulp something else JS, it would still work. But I don't want to tempt fate, so I have never changed it. So that's in the main root directory of my theme. And you can see here, I have var gulp equals required gulp. And all of this is handled by in JavaScript. So you don't have to worry about like how this gets required in and how it works. It just works. But you'll see here I have my gulp task, SASS, the same thing that we were looking at earlier. Source, assets, and now I have the SASS in here because I want to make sure that it's grabbing the SASS directory. And then anything within that SASS directory that has .scss. I want it to compile, and then this is the pipe, and then we want to run SASS. I want it to log on error. And then finally, I want it to go to the build CSS directory, which you'll see is not in my directory structure right now, but it will be. Automatically will create it. I also have a default task here, and basically the default task first runs the SASS task. I find this useful because any watcher task I have, because sometimes I want to start coding on something and I'll do like gulp, right? And I know that's going to be the watcher task, but I've already made a change to my file. And then I'm like, oh, snap, I forgot to turn on the watcher. So it's not auto compiling. So it's just easier to, when you are attaching a watcher file task, basically a watcher task, to have it run through everything first, because that way if you made any changes, it'll go ahead and build those first. That's just my experience. You could just have the default do, SASS by itself, then you could run gulp and then like gulp watch. I just find it easier to combine all that. So basically what this does, runs the SASS, then afterwards it returns the watcher. And in a second that this is how it does that watching. It takes on the same parameter as the source. And then anytime any of these files are changed, it runs through the SASS task. So I'm going to come back down here to my terminal. I'm going to run just gulp SASS, which is my SASS task, this task right here. and you'll see that it ran and it finished. And now if I look in my directory structure, I have a new directory called build in their CSS, and then matching child.styles.css. And this matches. So I have background blue, color red in my SCSS file. And in my CSS file, I have a compiled version. And I know basically exactly the same because we didn't really do anything sassy with it. It's just regular CSS at this point, but now it's there. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you what Gulp by itself does. So this is the default task. Basically, it ran through the SASS, and then it started to do the default task, which is just the watcher. And you can see it's actually not coming back to allow me to type anything. That's because it's actually sitting here waiting for me. So if I come back to the CSS file, and we're going to do some nesting, and I want all p tags within body to have text decoration of underline, and I hit save, you'll see that in my terminal window here, it automatically ran through the SASS. And if I open up that CSS file again, boom, it's right there. So I didn't have to run through another command in terminal. It automatically did that for me by itself. And as I said, nesting, really cool. I see that in my code, I'm working on the p tag within body, which ultimately got compiled to body p. This is really handy when you have something like, I know this is not, usually don't do something like this, but this is really cool when you have like 3, sometimes even 4 layers. I wouldn't recommend going above 4 layers, but let's say you have 3, 4 layers of code. It's really cool to see how they're nested, especially with indentation, and then it automatically builds it out into CSS without you having to do anything. The reason I love nesting so much is I remember when I first started coding, I'd be this guy who like, let me copy that, or let me copy that, right? And then I'd come down here, right? And then I have to paste again, like that. Like, I hated doing that. So nesting was like an easy way for me to just be, like, as soon as I saw nesting, I was sold for the most part. Gonna make a, get rid of this A. One more thing I want to point out, in the Gulp file, remember I had the SASS log error. I just want to show you what that looks like. So if I actually have a typo, something in my code, you'll see that an error pops up. Property color must be followed by a colon. It'll tell me what line of what file. This comes in really handy when you have a whole bunch of partials. Like when you have 10 to 15 partial files and you're working on one file, but you made an error in another one, but you haven't saved it yet, or whatever reason, it'll tell you exactly what line of what file the error is coming from. This is also handy if you change variables. So if you have variables in one file, in a partial, which is variables, and then you have 3 more files that are using those, if you change or delete a variable by accident, when you hit save, the error will come from one of the other files saying, hey, this variable is no longer defined. I've done that quite a few times, deleting or renamed a variable and just forgot about all the instances, or forgot about, let's say, one instance in one random partial. Yeah. So the last piece of all of this, now that we have our child/styles-styles.css, is actually to bring it all together with WordPress. In my functions file, I have enqueued my parent styling. That's how you have to, any child theme, you have to include the parent theming styles, basically. Like, so you have get template directory URI, and then the style. This is straight out of the WordPress codex for child themes. So I didn't even make this up, and this is their code. But what I did have to do is include my new CSS file. So underneath that, I have another style that I enqueued in, called it child SASS. Style sheet directory, and then it's in build CSS child styles.css. It doesn't really have any dependencies, but I want to tell it right now. I have it a basic version number of 1, and it applies to all media. So I save that. And pretty much all I have to do is go to the site, hit refresh, and boom. See how those colors changed? That's from that SCSS file. So let's look at something really particular. Let's try to do something that you would typically do with CSS or regular CSS, like entry A. So I'll come back here to a style sheet. I want this font size to be 3 em. Hit save. All I have to do is hit refresh. And boom, the font size changed. Super cool. And again, I didn't have to rerun Gulp. So the great thing about Gulp is it's running in the background, and I don't have to really touch it anymore. It runs with that watcher, so I don't have to keep on rebuilding it every time. All I have to do is change my code, hit save, and hit refresh. And obviously, if you're smart enough to get live reload working, don't even have to do that. You just save code, and next time you look at your browser, all the code will be updated. But that's about it. I mean, there's not much else to it. I can show you what some other stuff looks like, but maybe I want to see what Robert has up his sleeve. And obviously, for those who are on Windows, this whole process will be a little bit different. Obviously, a lot of the code will be the same, but you're not going to have things like terminal, right? So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Robert, and he's going to run through this whole process one more time, but in Windows, and hopefully he does a better job than I did.
All right. So here we have the wonderful Windows 10 desktop. Now, one of the bugbears when it comes to working in Windows, similar to Mac, I used to work on a Mac. I don't mind Mac. It's quite a nice environment, is that you have elevated permissions. And it can be a bit of a pain from time to time when running certain things. I've found from time to time, if I've installed Node the normal way, downloading the executable, it might run in one window, but it might not run in the other one because it has issues with editing and adjusting permissions. So very similar to Mac as well, there's a wonderful application, which is like a package manager for Windows called Scoop. And I'll just run through how to install that, how to use that, because that will allow you to manage everything you need to for one place. You'll never have to worry about permissions and elevated permissions and all that sort of stuff ever again. You'll know where everything is, and it will work pretty much all the time, really simplistically. Now, on a Windows machine, I think very similar to a Mac, you've got Finder. We can just hit Windows key and type in PowerShell. It should just be installed by default. I like to keep it in the taskbar, so we can do a pin to taskbar, and that way it'll always be there. If I do need an elevated instance, I can run as an administrator, and that gives me a little bit more power. You get that wonderful little pop-up. That's called the user access control or the user account control window. On most of my machines, I have a tendency to change that just a little bit. It's usually set reasonably high. I just like to drop it down just one notch, just so it doesn't pop up all the time. I've found from time to time, every once in a while, you will have to disable that 100%, depending on the application, usually just some line of business applications. I used to do it a lot for MyOb, but generally speaking, you can either leave it where it is if you don't mind the pop-ups on a regular basis, or you can just drop it down one notch, and it'll still protect you from low-level access to the system. So now that we've got PowerShell installed, it's fairly similar to the Linux command line. They've made it very similar to that in a way that I could do ls to get my folder structure. I can do clear. If you know anything about Windows, the previous command line system was called cmd.exe, and none of these commands would work in CMD. To clear screen, it was clrs or clear screen, whereas in PowerShell, it's more of a bash type of environment. But we're going to meld it just a teeny weeny little bit to make it very similar. So if you ever had to migrate onto a Mac or even a Linux machine, you would know exactly what you're doing pretty simplistically and pretty quickly. And a lot of the time, especially after many, many years of developing online using a Windows machine, you find that there are a large number of tutorials and guides of people who show you how to do things on Macs. And then when you try and do it on Windows, you're like, oh, but I've got a Windows machine. So this will allow you to migrate those kind of training sessions into a Windows environment. So the wonderful tool we're going to use is really, really simple. It's called Scoop. And because it's a bash sort of scripting language, they've actually given it scoop.sh as an extension. So it's really easy to remember. SH, of course, being the shell command sort of extension. And it's there's nothing here. It's just a really simple extension to install in PowerShell. We'll just copy that. Sometimes you have to hit Control-C as well. There's a little video here of the creator, who actually happens to be a local man living here in Brisbane. I think he's still in Brisbane. He's definitely an Australian guy. You can check out the Git repo. There's a couple of hundred people contributing to it. It's the thing I like about this. There's another application called Chocolatey, which can be used on Windows as well to help you manage certain things. I find this one to be a lot nicer, primarily because it's made up of what they call buckets and instances in the bucket. As you can see, each one of them is nothing more than a JSON file. So the construction of these files is almost the same as a Gulp file or a package.json file, in that it's not really complicated. It's just the basic information of where to get it, where to install it, some hash information. You can make one of these yourself pretty easily with a little bit of, with an hour or so of playing around. You could probably throw one together and make your own. I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm definitely thinking about it. But there are a lot of these little applications that you can install that just make working on a Windows machine so much easier. So we'll go back to Scoop, and we can just, like we said, we go Control Paste, open up PowerShell. PowerShell is cool because you can either do a Control V like in a normal Windows, or you can actually do a right click like in a bash command line, and press Enter, and it will fail. Again, because of the elevated permissions of Windows, it likes to not let you do too many things without certain permissions. So this is basically just saying, hey, you want to run a script that Windows didn't make. You get the same problem with drivers a lot in Windows too, where if it wasn't signed by Windows, Windows says it's not good, but this is fine. Trust me, this is fine. In PowerShell, to copy things, the simplest thing is to highlight and press Enter. And then again, we can right click and we'll just go yes, just to allow that one execution. We can go arrow up, back to our original command, and install Scoop. And as I said, Scoop's just really, really simple. It's the reason why I do like using it all the time and recommend it to so many people. So now Scoop's installed, I can just go Scoop and it gives me all the commands. If I want to find something to install, like say Node, I can just go Node. Actually, I have to go search Node, and it will search through everything with the word Node in it. So you can find a whole heap of different applications. I can do the same thing with scoop.search PHP, and it'll install PHP for me. There's just like I said, there's just an insane amount of stuff you can install. So what we're going to do is, I've found from time to time, if I'm working on my own project and we install Node and use NPM, installing the latest version works really, really well. Every once in a while, if I pull down someone else's project, especially if the package has been around for a while, the latest version of Node and NPM might have an issue and not run as well as it should. And it's usually just a Windows thing. So I've found to get around this, there's a wonderful application called the NVM, or the Node Version Manager, sorry. So we can install that. We can just go Scoop, install NVM. And this will allow us to actually have multiple versions of Node on our machine, and we can just switch between them anytime we want. And because Node is directly connected to NPM, once you would change the version of Node, you change the version of NPM. So now we can go NVM list. There's nothing installed. So we can go, well, I'll show you the list of commands here. There's some really good commands in there to do installs and stuff. One of the ones that I like the most actually is the NVM, I believe it's NVM install, and you can actually do an LTS install, which is the long-term service, I believe it stands for. So it gives you the version that you know that you're going to support for the longest period of time. I usually try and stick to the 6th version, but we can actually see what is available right now by doing nvm list available, and then we'll get to several different versions. We've got the really older versions, as you can see at the bottom, and the version 8 and the version 9. You stay away from the version 9 at this point in time because it's a bit fresh and a bit new, and it doesn't actually have an npm attached to that node version at this point in time. So to a usual environment, I usually try and stick with one of the highest ones, like 8, and then somewhere in the middle, like 6. So we can go nvm install 6.12.0, and that will just get that all configured. As you can see, my machine, like most Windows machines, there's got to be a very specific reason for you not to have a 64-bit machine these days. Is a 64-bit. It knows that that's a 64-bit. It figures out where to install it for you. Pretty much everything that you install in Scoop goes in the same spot under your user folder. So it's specific to your account, which keeps things nice and clean and tidy. So if somebody else wanted to log in, if you share the machine with somebody, and if you're using the computer at home, a lot of people have a tendency to share the computer. You don't have to have all that junk being shared around for multiple people. Whereas if you're installing it as an executable, it might install system-wide. So again, it gives you a lot more control. So we can also install, what's the 8.8.1? We've got 8.8.1, and it'll install that one as well. I'm still trying to figure out, there's a npm or a node package that you can install and run against the package, and it'll tell you exactly what version of node you need to run against it. I used it once, I think last week. I've forgotten what it was, unfortunately, but I've got to search it out and write a post about that because it was very helpful. And again, I think it's just a Windows environment thing. Most of the development stuff I have virtual Linux boxes, all Ubuntu based, running very clean lemp stacks, Linux, Nginx, MySQL, and PHP. So if I have issues with certain things, I can just jump into that environment and run things like in a clean sort of Linux system as if it was hosted on a normal machine. So now that we've got our NVM up and running, we can go NVM list, sorry, not KISS list. We've got 2 versions, so I can just go nvm use 6.12.0. It automatically asks me to elevate permissions just so I can do a quick install. And now I can go node B, and I can go npm B. And I've got 6.12 and 3.10. And if I ever wanted to, for some reason, I can go nvm use 8.8.1, elevated permissions again. Version 8's a lot faster in npm. Because you install version 8 of Node, you get Node 8.8.1, and you get npm 5.5.4.2. And it makes it, it actually does a lot of, I think they created that to try and sort of combat against things like Yarn, because Yarn's a comparable tool to npm, sorry. So now you can actually just do a scoop. We'll go back to scoop quickly and just make it a little bit easier for everyone to understand. You know, the potential that this application has is pretty insane. If I go scoop list, you can see I've only got that installed. I can go scoop search, learn how to spell. I never spell correctly. It's, like I said, it's got Yarn. There's a wonderful tool in here called YouTube DL where you can actually download YouTube videos into MP4s. It'll do a FFmpeg, MP3 encode, Telnet. If I really want, I've actually got it on my machine, scoop install sudo. So if you need to run things at an elevated command prompt in Windows, you can just use the sudo command instead of having to use, you know, usually you have to restart the application as administrator to get that to work properly. But one of my favorites is actually PS Haze. This one's really cool. So if you want that sort of environment that does remind you of or similar to, so you can have that sort of feel, you can do scoop install PS Haze, and this will make things a little bit more And basically now what you've got is a command line. LL, LS, I can go into a folder, and it's no different to actually operating as if you were in a normal command line. Windows actually has a bash line built into it now. They've been working with Ubuntu and actually have a subsystem of Linux that you can install on Windows. So if I brought up PowerShell on my desktop ever so quickly, you can see that I've got the PS Haze, PowerShell Haze running there. I can go bash, and it just gives me a complete, it's like Linux. It's not a virtual environment. It's actually a subsystem that does like an interpretation. And I can do a sudo app update, and it's not updating Windows, it's updating the subsystem of Linux that's on Windows, but that's probably for another sort of training session. So from that point on, it's pretty much the same sort of environment that Roy was talking about before, in that other things that you can install that would be necessary. You do a scoop install of Git. It'll do, it has a tendency to install its own dependencies, depending if the person who created it actually has added those in. So if it needs it, it'll install it for you. From time to time, I've always found, you can see that it shows you directories where it's installing everything. So it's really easy to find stuff. As I said, from time to time, I've installed applications and then needed to either make use that application directly, or maybe make a desktop shortcut. And I have no idea where I have actually installed that application. And thankfully, the person who wrote Scoop was kind enough to actually include that kind of functionality into the application. So you can easily just do scoop which and the name of the application you're looking for, and it'll tell you exactly where it is. Everything, like I said, everything's installed in the Scoop folder, which is located in your user folder. And so you'll find that under your username, it'll be C drive, users, your username, Scoop. So it's pretty easy to find. If you're in an environment with Windows, say in an office with maybe domain, sometimes you have group policies that share those things around. Works great. It'll just be another folder that gets migrated around like everything else. So again, I can go back to Scoop. It shows me all the stuff. I can go Scoop status. It tells me the status of Scoop. Scoop's out of date. I've already installed it, and it tells me it's out of date. So it manages itself pretty well. You can do a Scoop update. It'll also do a Scoop status and tell you if the Scoop itself is out of date or if the applications are out of date. They update on a regular basis, almost daily. I don't think I've updated mine on my local machine for a few days, but if I exit out of the bash command and do a Scoop status, it should tell me there's probably a few things that are out of date. I could do a Scoop update. It's probably just Scoop itself. Usually the FFmpeg stuff gets updated on a regular basis. It's a fantastic application to download YouTube videos if you want to watch them offline. So like I said, you can go Scoop which WHICH NVM. Tells me exactly where that executable is located. Because most of the time, like the NVM is an executable, Node's an executable. It's built specifically for Windows. This application is just helping you install them. So once you've installed everything, again, Windows has that nitpicking little thing where it likes to control things. So it actually has a checkup built in to make sure that everything's going to work fine. So you can do Scoop checkup, and it tells me that it's, hey, you've got some firewall stuff, some exclusions in place. So I could just go like that. I've installed sudo already. If I hadn't, it would tell me to install it. And I can create that one. So it's being really nice and using the sudo command, so I don't have to exit out, start up as an administrator, exit back in. If you use Windows for any length of time in a business environment, you know, these things can be such a pain from time to time. I missed my command window. There we go. Sometimes this window doesn't focus properly and it'll be hidden and nothing will work until you find it. So, and then if I go back to scoop checkup, everything's great and fine. Scoop status, everything's beautiful, nice and clean and easy. I can go to CD documents and go MKDIR, Roy Boy, because that's an easy thing to do, and do, oh, and if I wanted to, I could, what is it, git clone. I'll just quickly clone our repo. GitHub.com/the WP crowd. It's going to ask me to log in because this is a very clean, fresh installation of, oh, you are the lucky visitor. What did I do? I went somewhere I shouldn't have. Somebody's pinching domain names again. Sorry, WP crowd. Free SASS and training, and I can just go here, click that one, and we go back here, and like I said, sometimes it doesn't always like copy. I'm trying to figure out why that is. There we go. And just like Roy's instance, it'll do the git install, and then we can go in here and do an ls or an ll. I think they're supposed to be different, but for some reason it just uses exactly the same one. So npm install, and it downloads everything I need, and you would be hard pressed to see a differential between the two. I have a pretty decent machine, but like I said, this is a virtual machine running on top of my desktop, doing all this work. I do have, I'd say what they call in Australia, a really, really good connection, and most other places a pretty average connection when it comes to internet speeds. So if that's any sort of indication of how fast things, it's like 100 down and 40 up, which is pretty good. But it works great. It does everything we need it to do. LL, I can then should be able to do, oh no, I've got to spell, sorry. You can never touch type when people are watching. Clear, LL. We've got everything installed, the node modules installed. I can do, actually, if I wanted to, I could actually do scoop install Vim, because who doesn't like Vim? Everybody likes Vim. There's an extension on the buckets that you can actually install that actually allows you to install VS Code and Atom and WinDR Stat, which is an awesome Windows application, WinCSP, which is great for doing SFTP transfers, PuTTY. It installs everything, and the most useful thing about it is Windows is annoying because you have to reinstall it on a regular basis. I reinstalled mine 2 weeks ago. I do it at least once a year, maybe even every 6 to 9 months, just to keep it fresh. You can actually do a scoop export. It'll export all these things that you install, and then when you do the new machine, you just do scoop import, and everything's back to where it was. It's fantastic. It's so much quicker and simpler than going to Node and downloading that. If I need Composer, it will install that for me. If you need to find it, like I said, you don't have to spell it correctly. I could just do scoop search COMP, and it finds everything that's related to Composer, like Docker Composer, which is great. Just so many extra tools. OpenSSH, OpenSSL. You can install PHP, MySQL, the full MEMP stack. I've installed MongoDB, Python, version 2.7 and 3, because sometimes you need both. If you're doing anything with Ruby, Ruby gems, you'll need Python. It's unlimited. But from that point on, it's pretty much exactly what Roy just ran through in relation to Gulp and setting up your environment and stuff like that. You're pretty much in the same place. If I can do Vim Gulp file, as you can see, mine's uppercased as well. but that's Roy's file, so that's probably why it's uppercased. I don't think I've ever seen mine to be uppercased. I don't think I'm not too sure if it matters. I know from time to time, depending on the environment, casing is very important. But as you can see, this is Vim running on a Windows computer. It operates exactly the same way Vim does. I can do a quit and I'm back out again. So I think that's about it for me.
It's exactly why when I first got requested to do this with Windows, I was like, no, nor do I have a Windows machine that I can easily access, and I don't really want to set up a VM to do Windows. That seems very backwards. So, no, that was really good. Thank you, Robert, for doing that. That's going to wrap it up. Does anyone who's on, I think we lost a few people, went a little bit longer, but does anyone who's on have any questions for us? If not, no problem. I'm just going to wrap up here. So again, if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to check out the WP Crowd. We have this free training, obviously, and we will try to add a new one every so often. And if you really want something that's more custom, if you have a specific need that you aren't finding a solution for, go ahead and fill out the form on the WP Crowd in that free training page. And what I'm going to do is kind of create a training or one of these sessions that would be broad enough to actually allow more people to learn something. And we might use your example as a use case for how to do it. And then that way you learn how to do something new and we get to teach you how to do it. It's a lot of fun. And yeah, I'm pretty excited to do some more of these. Hopefully Robert will join us in the future for future Windows and non-Windows related ones. But I'm hoping to actually venture out from just the dev world and hopefully do some cool like business focused ones. And I know Bridget, who's here in Southern California, who's big on Twitter, would want to do a Twitter one. So we're gonna do some cool stuff. So you know, feel free to subscribe to our channel and keep up to date. So with that, thank you again, Robert, for joining. And I will see you guys next time.